Missile Institute and Aerospace Corporation, I wanted to thank you for being here for this, the next to last of our breakfast seminars on space power this year. As you know, today we're releasing a report that we did in collaboration with the Aerospace Corporation, but I wanted to say hello to our chairman of our board, former Secretary of the Air Force, Whit Peters. Thank you for being here. Also want to say to my friend, hello, Frank Rose, used to be, I think you spoke here about 10 times, and he's now with the Aerospace Corporation. I also want to thank the wonderful people that have made this possible, Diana, Robin, Monica, and Jack from the Aerospace Corporation, and Nikki and Mark and Nate, particularly Nikki, who I think this year has hosted over 50 events for the Mitchell Institute and has done such an extraordinary job. Thank you. Also, our last breakfast this year will be on Friday with General Raymond, the head of the U.S. Air Force Space Command. We are also going to have a roundtable after the breakfast he has to leave at 9:40, so we're going to do it very quickly right after the breakfast at 9 o'clock. Let us know if that's something you'd be interested in, and we will try to help you out. I would like to have our three speakers and our moderator, Jamie, Morin, Jim Vedda, and Pete Hayes, please take the stage here, and my boss, General Deptula, the Dean of the Mitchell Institute, will introduce our three speakers. With that, would you give a warm welcome to General Dave Deptula.
Well, thanks, Peter, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Secretary. Great to have you here. Today, as Peter mentioned, the Mitchell Institute, in collaboration with the Aerospace Corporation, is releasing our newest policy paper entitled Major Policy Issues in Evolving Global Space Operations. And we've asked our two authors, Dr. Pete Hayes of the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University and Dr. Jim Vedda of the Aerospace Corporation, to speak this morning about their report. And we're very pleased to have with us Dr. Jamie Morin, the Vice President for Space Policy of the Aerospace Corporation, to moderate the discussion. I'd like to very much thank the authors for your hard work in putting the paper together. Our Director of Strategic Deterrence Studies, who proposed the idea, that's Peter, and especially our production team that Peter mentioned earlier, who produced the publication so quickly. The paper is designed to inform decision makers on how to optimally develop national space policy. This is a topic of growing importance, as everyone in here is aware, as operations in space are growing in criticality to our nation's security. We believe this policy paper will help our nation's leadership recognize the actions required to bolster our space architecture and operations. With that, will you please join me in giving a warm welcome to our two authors and our moderator for this morning event, Dr. Jamie Moore.
Well, good morning, everyone. Let me make a minor adjustment. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back at the Capitol Hill Club. Peter, I think this is my second visit to the stage here at one of your and AFA's breakfasts in this calendar year. I may have to apply for associate membership. Although I'm not sure they'd have me.
Yeah, we'll do that if it comes with money.
It's great to see so many old friends and also to meet some new folks. What we're rolling out today is a little bit of an unconventional paper for a DC think tank, and there's a reason for that. As many of you probably know, Aerospace Corporation is a federally funded research and development center. Our core focus is on being the space enterprise, FFRDC, supporting government in making tough engineering choices on space programs. We've increasingly recognized, though, that making the tough engineering choices starts well before programs are initiated. It starts when you're really defining the problem and defining the requirements and defining the goals. And what our Center for Space Policy and Strategy is really focused on is helping space decision makers crystallize those choices so that they've got smart alternatives at the intersection between policy, technology, and economics. We don't do advocacy. We're happy to help crystallize issues, but we're not going to tell you do A. And so that's what makes this a little unconventional in a Washington environment where you're overwhelmed with people giving you short papers telling you exactly what to do and generally not exactly why, because they're working an agenda. We're not working an agenda, and that's why it's been great to watch this collaboration between Dr. Jim Vedda and Dr. Pete Hayes. What they've been able to do as part of working on this paper is bring together a pool of more than 30 leading experts in space policy, space technology. And those folks shared extensive ideas, some in person, some electronically. And then they were able to run that accumulation of ideas through a really top-notch advisory committee, a couple of members of whom are able to attend with us today, but I will leave them nameless to protect the innocent until you decide whether or not you're going to reward this paper with your applause. The paper does some interesting things. Again, it's about identifying where we have emerging consensus, where we have a growing sense of the nature of the problem, and where we have a growing consensus about the kinds of contours of the way forward. We let our experts speak for themselves here. So there will be places in this report where people are quoted quite directly as saying we ought to do X, but we'll leave it to the reader to evaluate the views of the different experts and and make sense of which recommendations there are on target. So there's some really interesting themes in the paper. A couple of them jump out, and you'll see them clearly in the introduction, but they surround some growing consensus about the nature of the emerging space domain. You see a series of themes among the 11 questions that the experts opined on. You see a bunch of themes that come in the vein of what I would call crowded space. So things about allocation of scarce resources, about spectrum, about debris on orbit, and how the policy environment that served us well in outer space at a period where there wasn't as much activity from as many different players may not persist, may not be suitable into the future. You also see some themes that come out that relate to the emergence of a contested environment. And obviously anybody that's been attending these breakfasts has a sense of the emerging consensus about the need for our military, our intelligence community, and indeed other players around the world to acknowledge the fact that in a time of conflict, space is likely to be directly contested. And in some cases, it's already being contested today. So there's some good themes and discussion around those issues and some areas where we identify need for additional work. There's also a lot in the domain of what I would call the democratization of space, meaning the addition of new actors who might not be part of the norms of behavior that emerged when space was a superpower competition or a dominant U.S. actor environment, and everybody else was sort of second fiddle. Now with commercial companies, with a whole bunch of new nations, with even high schools operating in space, there is potentially a need to think through new sets of norms and to build others' adherence to norms. So these are all topics that come out, but I would really encourage folks to look through the breadth of the paper and the 11 topics addressed in there. Let's start, gentlemen, if we can, since this is Washington and we have distinguished colleagues from the news media here, and news, shares the root of novel, new. Let's talk about what is new and what is surprising. Jim, if I can start with you, what were the biggest surprises that emerged as you surveyed the experts that were involved here and pulled their thoughts together? Oh, and I'm sorry, Jim, I almost failed. I failed to remember that I'm responsible for actually introducing you. On my left, Jim Vedda, Dr. Jim Vedda, a member of the technical staff at Aerospace Corporation for over a decade, formerly a professor of space policy at the University of North Dakota. North Dakotans? Oh, that must be the nuclear breakfast, sorry. Jim has been a terrific colleague here. He's got a background in space policy that is longer and deeper than almost anybody in the business. So delighted to have you, Jim, as part of the team at Aerospace and to have you as the lead author here. And then on my right, Dr. Pete Hayes, for whom I could repeat many of the same items of praise, but Pete has been providing personal support to a bunch of government offices over the years. He's part of an effort to ensure that our defense decision makers have the best insights possible into space, and has been sitting in the Pentagon on a day-to-day basis supporting some of the key organizations there, the names of which change on a daily or weekly basis. Pete has, both of these gentlemen have multiple books to their name on space policy issues and are really highly regarded in the field. And so I'm delighted to have both of them here. Now, Jim, what surprised you the most, and where did we end up with a lot of new discovery?
I guess what I felt was most surprising was the high level of concurrence that we had on certain issues. Now, this group of people that participated was by no means a bunch of like-minded people. They had different backgrounds, came from different perspectives, and would not necessarily be anticipated to agree on so much. But as we found when we compiled all the responses, that there were certain areas where there was a remarkable level of concurrence. We also obviously tried to identify areas of discord that still need to be worked out, but it was quite remarkable that people who are experts in this area from the inside and outside the government, some international, and they came together on a lot of the issues. Now, my own optimistic approach of how you can do policy is that if you can get enough people to agree on a course of action, and it doesn't defy physics, you can probably do it. So, even if that's maybe a little overly optimistic, this study proves that there is quite a bit of concurrence in certain areas, and if I can mention one that I think was most prominent in my mind was the area of new applications in space that deal with the actual physical manipulation of things in space. Going beyond the things that we have traditionally been doing, which involve electromagnetic signals, such as communications, navigation, various types of remote sensing, very successful things that have evolved over decades, but we're starting to develop into a new area that's going to have new applications where you have the manipulation of physical objects either through on-orbit construction or through on-orbit servicing, debris cleanup, these types of areas. We asked, actually, initially when we put out the survey, we asked two separate questions about proximity operations, what should we do about that, and a separate question on non-Earth imaging. Both things that are starting to develop and have great benefits and great risks potentially associated with them. And almost every respondent to those questions said, this isn't really two questions, this is one question. Let's just talk about how do we respond to the proliferation of space applications in general. And the response that everybody came up with is, it's time to start assuming that everything you do in space and everything about your spacecraft can be seen, and rendezvous is going to become common. Let's address that as something that will happen, that we can't stop, and if we try to stop it in some way with our own activities, we're just going to see others around the world race ahead of us. I mean, that was across the board the finding for people who participated in this, and I thought that was one of the things that struck me the most about the study.
So Pete, that on that topic, in addition to your work in government, of course, you're a professor in the Space Policy Institute and have been, through the years there, teaching some of the rising stars in space policy as part of that program at George Washington. When you're talking with students there, mid-career or early career, and they're approaching these questions with maybe less baggage than those of us that came up during Cold War or early post-Cold War periods, do you see a shift in views or new approaches to questions like the ones Jim has mentioned relative to what the sort of traditional government approaches are on those?
Well, I sure do, and let me just first thank you all for coming out to this. It's really a great honor and privilege to be a part of this study. I learned a real lot, and I see many colleagues around the room, many of my former students, so I appreciate that question. I also just need to emphasize that I'm speaking purely on my own behalf, not an official position of anybody. So, as Jim mentioned, I mean, one of the things that really struck us was how much unanimity there was on many of the questions that we asked. And I think it's interesting to me that it really cut across very wide range of perspectives and age groups and international, commercial, government, civil actors. So that in and of itself I thought was very unique and encouraging, because there are those central tendencies and perspectives that we have quite a bit of consensus on, and I'm encouraged that we can move forward in those areas. Of course, the challenge will be actually getting government to move forward and realize and capitalize on these opportunities. So one of the things that we are recommending more as a specific recommendation, what the government needs to do in this regard with all the new opportunities coming online commercially, is the government needs to really decide what it is that it absolutely must do and maintain as a government function in space. A thing that's inherently governmental that it can't give over. So nuclear command and control, I'm pretty sure we're not going to outsource that to somebody else. But probably every other mission should at least be a part of a dialogue about whether that can be shared or maybe perhaps given completely over to commercial and international partners. So the opposite end of the spectrum would be something like environmental monitoring, and you can see that the government doesn't have a lot of programs of record going forward to do that mission, so I think they are somewhat moving in that area. But what I'm suggesting is that it needs to be much more intentional and much more transparent with respect to these are the things that we are going to do as a government. These are the things that we can share as a joint responsibility between commercial and international partners. And these are the things that we can rely solely on international or commercial partners to provide that service. So not that many years ago, there just wasn't a possibility to do this, and it's an exciting possibility. But again, what I think the greatest challenge is going to be is for our government to seize that opportunity in a transparent manner and make it real clear what our position is on that.
So, Pete, when we were going through the first round of Post-Budget Control Act reductions in the Department of Defense, we had just wrapped up a round of insourcing of various federal functions that we thought would generate some savings by moving back to government performance. And then, but we weren't quite done. And what we found is as we made that transition, some of the things that we were insourcing turned into no sourcing. Meaning, we had an external contractor providing it, we intended to move to an internal provider, but the money ran out, and so instead we just did without. Did you sense any, what sort of views did you find among the survey participants in terms of whether some of these functions, which have historically been performed by government, should in the future be procured by the government as a service? The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration pays for, storm data from a commercial or an international partner. Vice, just allow the market to address it. Was there consensus there?
Well, I would have to
And
say
Jim, you
there's
can
probably a
jump in.
little less consensus on that. I mean, you're getting to one of the most difficult challenges in that regard. And it requires a different mindset on the part of the government because traditionally space has been very stovepiped where one entity bought this capability, they have tight control over not only the operations of that system, but where all the data from that system go. So this is a really different model, and it's going to be difficult for many in the government to transition over. And we don't want to be Pollyannish about this. We know that not all these things are going to come to fruition, so the government needs to be a smart shopper in that regard and think about where the main trends are and where the most likely commercial viability lies, because not all of this is going to come to fruition. I mean, those of us that are old enough remember teledesic. So that isn't all that long ago, and there was great prospects for having internet in space and all kinds of other things like that. I believe things are different today, but again, not all of this is going to go through exactly as Elon Musk or anybody else envisions. So it's really incumbent on the government to do its homework and think about which of those things might be more enduring and commercially viable and leverage those kind of things. And if I might, I just want to really put a plug in for the security dimension of this, to me, is really the most exciting because we've been talking a long time about resilience. Well, these large commercial architectures are pretty much tailor-made to provide a more resilient approach to space. And if you look at the Office of the Secretary of Defense's white paper on resilience, it talks about 4 Ds and 2 Ps. So deception, distribution, disaggregation, diversification, protection, and proliferation. And if you think about it, almost every one of those aspects can be at least advanced via these commercial architectures. And it provides really exciting opportunities. But again, we've got to think creatively about that. And it's not going to be business as usual. We can't have a stovepiped architecture that we in the government develop the requirements for, operate, and get all the data from. We're going to have to be flexible. And perhaps it's not going to come through in the ways that we envision, but I still think it's going to be better than us trying to build business as usual type of architectures with a very small number of government-owned nodes.
Those are certainly big issues under debate right now. Jim, as you look across some of the specific areas that the study delved into, you hinted just a few moments ago about the rise of proximity operations as part of on-orbit servicing and some of the other emerging space applications, non-Earth object imaging. Can you expand a little bit on some of the key findings from the interviews and where the experts thought about those areas, some of the growing challenges and opportunities there?
I think you find that there's general concurrence about an issue as to which direction we need to go, but the specifics of carrying it out are still a matter of some debate. And I'll give the example of active debris removal, one of the areas that we touched on in here. Across the board, the respondents were saying that, yes, government has a role to play in developing active debris removal, but did not feel that government should be an anchor tenant for commercial development of this. The question becomes that, what is that role? Is it the funding of research and demonstrations? Is it making government data and facilities available to the private sector? Is that one of the approaches? Should there be some set aside for investing in these activities as they are developed by the private sector? That level of detail in how to carry this out was in some dispute, but the notion that the government should play some role and should encourage this was definitely across all of our respondents. So I think that we need to delve a little deeper beyond what we did in this study to try and nail down some of these things. Another example being the the tracking of small sats. That was one of the topics that we covered in the study. And everybody pretty much agreed that we should have every satellite, regardless of its size, have some type of tracking aids on it, active, passive, or both. But the question became, should they be mandatory? Should there be specific types of tracking aids specified? There's where you have to still work out the details. But there was broad agreement that every satellite should have some kind of tracking aids. So we're on a good path to coming together on what is the problem and how should we attack it, and we're always told that that's the first step to getting it done.
Of course, the challenge with these kinds of issues is they're easy to agree to in principle, and then when there's money involved, they get a lot harder to...
Oh, you had to bring up money. Oh,
I'm sorry. How much of that came out in the study, the degree to which the folks you're talking with recognize that when the policy world intersects with the financial decisions that both government and private companies have to make, that some of the things that may sound unobjectionable or even essential in principle become less clear-cut?
We didn't spend a lot of time questioning or discussing the where should the money come from in this study. Obviously, that's an undercurrent to everything that people are considering, especially new developments. But that was not a focus of the study. Pete, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Well, right, I mean, we didn't really focus there, we were focused more on what we ought to be doing instead of how to get it done. So perhaps that could be a follow-on study.
Perhaps.
Excellent. Let's talk a little bit more on the debris side, Jim. You just opened that topic as well. So obviously space situational awareness, most everybody in the room will understand there's a strong imperative analytically to get to improved situational awareness ahead of the arrival of much larger satellite constellations, and this may even need to migrate into a more active space traffic management approach. But talk a little bit about how your international participants and your U.S. domestic participants approached those kinds of issues where, to date we've had largely a state-oriented approach with each country licensing its own launches and so forth. Did you see any differences there or pressures that we need to look to down the road?
Well, there was some tendency for international participants to immediately tackle the issue as how do we set up some type of global system for making this happen and ensuring space safety and security collectively. Whereas in the U.S. we tend to think of how do we improve what we already have, and how do we integrate commercial components that are emerging. International participants would tend to feel like, well, is there some analogy here to things like ICAO or
the civil aviation?
For civil aviation, or the International Maritime Organization for performing these types of things. And one of the things that we've learned in our lessons from many years of observing those two organizations I just mentioned is that they're very good at working out technical standards and safety issues across many participants. ICAO, for example, has about 190 countries involved in it, and that system works pretty well because they stick to technical standards and safety. In the past, what has been tried and has failed is to try and get a big multilateral organization to get into issues that are more economic and political, like landing rights, schedules, fees that are charged, fares that are charged for airlines, for example. That always fails on a multilateral level. But we have dozens and dozens of bilateral agreements tackling those issues that work pretty well. So we may see this develop in a similar way for space. We go multilateral when we're talking about tech standards and safety. We go bilateral when we're talking about the other things, the economic and political issues. That's what's worked for maritime and for aviation. Maybe that's what'll be working for space as well.
So sort of an umbrella with individual activity underneath it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if I might, I would just add that I was really struck by how much consensus there was on that area, that at least among our respondents, no one was of the opinion that business as usual is going to be good enough going forward.
Right.
So because of the increasing number of debris objects, because of all the increasing commercial activities, different models are needed, and we need to evolve this entire regime to accommodate that different reality. So I'm not sure that's what you always hear out of the U.S. government. They tend to want a more incremental approach and put some kind of Band-Aids on this, but at least among our respondents, they were pretty much unanimous that that's just not going to be good enough. The tipping point has been passed, and we need to think about different ways of doing this, or things will be just increasingly unviable.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struck that if the future constellations that are planned really do come to fruition, we're looking at more than doubling the total number of objects on orbit, you know, relative to everything we put, total number of active objects on orbit, relative to everything we've put up since Sputnik. So this is pretty big change. It would make sense that you might need to adapt your policy regime in order to address that level of, that scale of shift. I want to get to one more topic, pull out from our, from the two of you before we throw the floor open for Q&A from the audience. Everybody please stand ready in that regard. All three of us used to teach, or do teach now, so we will call on students at random if required. Let's talk about space deterrence. And this is a topic that warrants, you know, multiple independent papers, and many people disagree whether it's even a viable concept in and of itself. But what kind of thoughts emerged from your interviews and discussions here? Is this an area where there's still a lot of differences among the experts, or is this another one of those topic areas where people are coming together?
Let me defer to Pete on that, because he wrote that section of the report. So.
Well, we talked a lot about unanimity and consensus, but really in that section, we didn't have that. So I guess I don't find that surprising. I mean, it's a very difficult, long-standing issue, as you mentioned, Jamie, and people would like to get further downfield and have more meat to this than they perceive as there now, but I just don't think we're quite there yet. So really the big distinction amongst our respondents was, can folks see space deterrence as its own independent thing that's somehow separated from deterrence on Earth, or is it just part of a seamless whole of deterrence writ large? And really, it was pretty much evenly split in that regard. And of course, depending on how you answer that question has some pretty big implications for how you would go forward with trying to strengthen deterrence in either terrestrially or just in space. One other piece I really want to mention in this regard is we did not ask a question to our in our survey about security classification, but that issue came up over and over in response to all, not every question, but the majority of questions. And among our respondents, they feel like there's a large need to lower classification levels across the board. And it would be important in the deterrence context, it would be important in the space tracking context, norm development. Almost all of the major international flavored issues have some kind of component that's related to how much information that right now the government, the U.S. government mainly holds, can be made available or more easily made available. And that's just kind of part of this overall sea change about the democratization of space, and who knows what and when did they know it, and how did they get that information. I would also just mention that several of our respondents pointed to the fact that as we move to persistent coverage and big data analytics gets better and better, there's probably going to be a lot of ways, non-traditional ways, to gain more information about both space and Earth. So our ideas of how we hide things now or just don't talk about them are probably also becoming increasingly unviable going forward in the future. So to me, that was really interesting, and we highlighted it in the report, even though we didn't specifically ask that as a question.
Personally, I always find the injected topics that were not contemplated by the researcher are often the most interesting of all. So, and for those of you who did participate in the study, thanks for that. This is one of those cases where I think we opened some topics that were well worth discussing. All right, well, let's take the opportunity. I think we could talk another 20 minutes here, easy, but let's take the opportunity to open the floor and get some of the thoughts from folks in the audience. Sir.
I'll have an easy question for you all. You know what I've been doing this for a long time, 20 years. And I remember 30 years. I remember the day at Air Force Base Command where they made us change uniforms and we started wearing flight suits, and the General Order said, "Hey, you're all warfighters." I'm like, wow, just yesterday we were doing force enhancement. Then we all became warfighters, and the term that we used today, contested, we started driving. We, the United States, started driving that contested environment. And if you don't believe me, just read a little bit. We drove the contested environment. Of course, we and the Russians had done low-level counter space activities. We tested our own ASAT and said, crap, that's not good. So we drove the contested environment, and now you see a lot of money in that area, the counter space. So the great policy dilemma is, how do we put that in the bag? Because all of the solutions come to one word, and that's transparency. Transparency in SSA, which we, the United States, have historically been the greatest opponents of. And that's driven international developments. Transparency for RPO, which we, the United States, have been the greatest opponents of. And now we're kind of stuck in the commercial world where people are doing RPOs all over the place. We're like, what the hell is going on? Transparency in classification. You mentioned going to commercial, and you mentioned new systems. We have been around for 50 years at Intelsat. We're operating 77 satellites. You don't need to wait for those deterrence, the resiliency that you highlighted. You don't have to wait till 2020 when OneWeb. It's now. And we're just one company. We have 50 satellites on orbit ready for the U.S. government to transition to in wideband satellite. And they've been hemming and hawing about that for 10 years. And it's getting worse because of this great policy dilemma. So I'll stop that. How did you guys address, or how do you recommend, because many of the people in this room are dealing with that now. How do we put the contested space in a bag, considering, and I'm not naive, there is a lot of money that many people in this room, their companies are making a lot of money, growing amounts of money, due to our drive for a more contested space environment.
Do you want to take
Sure.
a piece of
I
that?
appreciate that question, Mylan. I mean, and your long-standing background in all of this. I would characterize things a bit differently, and I would go to the Director of National Intelligence's assessment, where he said it would be basically stupid of our adversaries not to develop counter space capabilities, and we can expect them to go forward. So our terrestrial military power is enabled and rests upon our space capabilities, and they want to erode that, and they want to deter us from intervening or winning a conflict. So I don't think that's going to go away. You know, when we asked our respondents what's the best way to deal with it, many of them had, I would characterize as your approach, where we need to redouble diplomatic efforts and take that, redouble those efforts and try and get more successes. It's instructive to me, though, that I think we have tried that pretty long and hard. You know, people can debate about how sincere we were at various points, but we certainly have tried it repeatedly over decades, and we haven't made a lot of progress. So that probably ought to tell us something, that in this domain it's difficult to reach those kind of robust agreements that would really provide for greater security and transparency across all the parties. But let me just say, I am optimistic now, because I believe that this democratization of space and much more robust commercial architectures is going to lead the way out of necessity for the commercial actors for things to be better, more predictable, and more secure. Will it ever get back to a benign environment? I don't think so. I don't think that's in the cards. I think space is just too important, and frankly, it may get worse before it gets better.
Next
Hey,
question.
yes. Across the space domain, this sort of questions of whether the organizational structures aligned to the problem are live. Of course, in the Congress earlier this year, we had introduction of another piece of legislation designed to sort of move to a one-stop shop for licensing of commercial activity in space, moved to the Department of Commerce. You know, that's an idea that has been debated a fair bit. It has pros and cons, of course, but it is clear, and in fact a separate report that the Center for Space Policy and Strategy released just last week on the small satellite regulatory roadmap lays out pretty explicitly that it's a extremely complex licensing regime right now, with new players coming into the market who are new to it and who maybe are doing fairly small scale operations. The complexity of finding your way through that is a tax, if you will, that probably stands in the way of some innovation. So either clarifying or restructuring would be options to make those kinds of new entrants more comfortable, give them a better chance of coming in. Again, we'll leave that to the government to evaluate, but it was pretty clear from building the roadmap that it was a spaghetti junction of highways. Jim, do you want to?
Just to echo what you were saying, that we deliberately avoided getting into the discussion of how to re-wicker organizations in national security space. We had to put some boundaries on what we would put in this report because we wanted to cover an assortment of issues that would be relevant to decision makers in the current administration, not the far future, but things that may come along in the next few years. And we didn't want this to be a book-length project that would not be read by anybody. So one of the things we did avoid was the management issues.
Do you think it can cope with it as structured? I mean, you know this stuff better than most people.
Well, let me just say that for more than 20 years, we've had a significant reorganization of national security space about every 2 to 3 years. The current structure is just over 2 years old under the principal DoD Space Advisor. But that's par for the course. So every couple of years, they just want to change it around. And what does that say about our level of satisfaction with how well this is getting the job done?
Yeah. Unless it's just to keep the adversaries guessing.
Well, there is that.
Are we that smart?
We can't tell you that,
Yeah,
Colin.
that's fine.
We don't have a view on
It's look, it's an important question, and I think that what Pete gets to here is really at the heart of it. We've been dissatisfied sequentially with almost every organizational structure we've chosen. That may tell you that the problem is not an organizational problem. The problem is it's a really complex and challenging domain. And in a really complex and challenging domain, we're likely to be dissatisfied with our ability to respond. And we're playing that out through organizational structure.
And it is in fact dynamic. I mean, the correct organizational structure today may be the wrong one a year or two from now. That's one of the things that we live with.
Use this, Jim, because your mic
it
may
not?
be off.
Did I hit the button?
Just go ahead with that. All right, we have another question from the field here. Ma'am.
Jim.
Victoria over here.
Hi.
Oh, yeah.
Victoria San Francisco Foundation. Pete and Jim, I want to say this is a really fascinating paper, and I look forward to digesting it more over the coming days. Just do a quick read. I was really struck by one of the findings for the counter space section that called for increased U.S. focus and leadership on diplomatic approaches. which, I will support entirely. But one thing that really struck me, I'm wondering if anyone mentioned it, the part of the State Department that's scheduled to actually deal with security space issues is missing its leadership. It has not had its appointees put into place. And that's really affected their ability to actively participate in international discussions on space and security and stability issues. I'm wondering if that came up and what do people say about that?
Well, it's a good question, Victoria. It did not specifically come up amongst our respondents. I will mention, I got to go to the first meeting of the Revitalized Space Council, and Secretary Tillerson was there and made it very clear that he has a very deep personal interest in space and space diplomacy, so he asked very substantive questions and really held the floor in ways that many of his other colleagues on the Space Council did not. So I thought that was encouraging, and I take your point completely that across the board at state there's some pretty big gaps with political appointees.
And all further questions on that should be directed to Frank Rose, who is here in the audience.
Can we blame Frank?
Okay. Sandra?
Yes, Sandra Irwin with Space News. Peter, I wanted to follow up on your comment about the government has to decide what it wants to do, what it wants to outsource. I mean, that's a very old conversation, as you know. It's been, talked about in many areas of national security. So what do you think is really new in this conversation now on space and outsourcing? Thanks.
Well, I think what's different is that the breadth of all the commercial stuff coming online is different, and it creates a exciting opportunity which our respondents characterize as the best opportunity in a generation. So I don't think we've had that. And I'd also say that, yes, the government has talked about that a lot, but it hasn't really, in a transparent way, really settled on many of those kind of fundamental issues with respect to this is going to be just a government issue or mission area. These things will be shared with commercial and international partners, and these things could be done completely with commercial services. And, kind of going back to the organizational issue, because space things take so long to develop and they operate for a very long time, really the only approaches that make sense are things that are held in place for a long time. I mean, we should decide on that and then stick to it for 10 years. And then we might realize some of these benefits. But if we keep churning it every 2 to 3 years and decide that, oh no, this is going to be commercial now, or this is going to be government only, and churn that around, it will be counterproductive.
Is any agency moving forward on that more so than others?
Well, I mean, one of the other difficulties is that this is truly no one's job in the government to do this. So one of the things I mentioned, the Space Council, they really are positioned in a good place to do that, and I'm hopeful that they will take on that challenge as a specific policy issue that they address.
Jim, did you want to?
One more. No, Jim, do you have something?
No, go ahead.
Colin Lee?
Hi, thanks. Colin Lee from the House Appropriations Committee, Subcommittee on Defense. From the defense perspective, when we talk about commercial versus government versus even civil, a lot of the companies I talk to, a lot of the capabilities that we see over the horizon, we're all extremely excited about. The actual commercial viability without the U.S. government or another government as a significant customer is questionable. We see companies that are, for the low cost of 75% of our business, we can be a commercial company. Did you look at that during the, what is commercial? This is something that we all struggle with. And we're very excited about a lot of the companies that are coming up and their ability to contribute to the national security mission. But if we're, if the U.S. government or another government is 75%, or I'm making that number up, maybe we should go, back to Mylan's point, maybe we are, sort of stuck in the wonderful relationship that we have with our traditional primes.
Yeah. I mean, Colin, just let me start us on that a little bit, but in my head, I've always sort of had a three-tiered view on this issue. There's the commercial stuff that's going to happen regardless of what government does. And so today, traditional ComSats are obviously in that, right? If the government's decided to stop buying commercial satellite bandwidth altogether, if the US government or even governments around the world, that industry would be significantly smaller, right? Governments are a non-trivial customer, but it's not gonna go away. Second is government as anchor tenant, as you laid out, and those are the cases where essentially the government is able to make a business case close, but once it closes, the company is viable and is gonna stay around. And then there's the other category where the 75% type case you're bringing up, where there is no business absent, no material business absent the government. And I think your policy solutions in each of those have to be tailored to figuring out your policy solutions in each issue area need to be tailored to which kind of commercial market that is, which of those three. Because if it's the second one, major governments need to decide, do you want this market to exist or not? And it may be in your national security or economic interest for it to exist. It may be that it's in your economic interest but not your national security interest. And it may be in that you don't have any strong interest. And there you're really on the cusp and powerfully influential. That's an uncomfortable place for a US government, right? Because we don't like to make industrial policy if we can avoid it. But those are the ones where the analytics have to be really sharp. Gentlemen, you want to add thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I just feel that we shouldn't be too squeamish about government being a customer because, let's face it, folks, government's part of the market. It's not a separate thing, it's part of the market. I mean, what is it that something like 20% of GDP, I don't know the exact number, is government activity. So to say that the government is going to not pick winners or not be an anchor tenant, the government has to pick something. The government picks what it needs to carry out its responsibilities. If that helps to stimulate the development of a new industry and that anchor tenancy is temporary, then that's great. The government's done its job in stimulating the market and the commercial sector. The question becomes, is the government ever going to be able to get off of that anchor tenancy? We've seen that that's been a very difficult challenge in remote sensing, for example. So it's going to be a case-by-case determination, unfortunately. There's no magic formula. But we should keep in mind that though we in this country like to avoid talking about industrial policy, as Jamie mentioned, the fact that we declare there is no industrial policy actually means there is an ad hoc industrial policy. So we have to be careful about how we set that up and so that we don't miss opportunities to create a useful new industry in this country that, in addition, helps the government do its job.
Let me borrow your second.
Could I just mention one other thing? You asked what's commercial. So in space, I think it's quite different than many other sectors because you have billionaire space enthusiasts. Are those commercial actors in the sense of other commercial entities? I mean, I'm not sure they're primarily out there to make money because they have some kind of different vision. We have kind of new space that sees space romantically and maybe is going to do things that aren't as commercially viable. But the ones I'm most interested in for things really being enduring is what I would call new space, which they don't really care about space. They just want space as a way to get data. And they're plugging it into all these new big data analytic things and persistent coverage. So, I mean, that's where my money is. I mean, I love Elon Musk and I wish him well and we need to ride that horse as well as we can, but he's pretty good at, going the other way as well. But if we can leverage the folks that don't care romantically about space and are just using it as a means of providing data persistently and plugging it into all these things that are going to shape the world going forward, that to me is the most exciting opportunity.
Thanks.
Yeah, not entirely new either, right? If you think about it, the amount of money that comes from space-enabled economic activity, like the amount you pay for a direct TV subscription, dwarfs the cost of putting those satellites on orbit, the direct space economy. It's the services that are enabled by space that are really the major economic player, as opposed to the, building and launching satellites. So thanks for the question, Colin. And let me offer just one closing thought, which is, I think I can probably speak for the Mitchell Institute a little bit here as well, but certainly for the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, we value the expertise in rooms like this, and we are always open to people's suggestions, even if you weren't on our panel of experts, for the happening, exciting topics in space and in space policy. Bring them to our attention. We can't promise you we'll pursue them, but it does help to inform our research agenda. We're looking to help educate and inform a community of which the people in this room are a very important part. Peter?
Thank you, Jamie and Pete and Jim. Thank you for an extraordinary study. It's quite a turnaround. I think we agreed to do this in the first week in August. So I think that was quite a turnaround. I want to thank our sponsors that are here today. I don't thank you often, maybe enough, but thank you, because without your support, the series cannot go on. And I want to thank Kath Ryan, who's my partner, who we are now busy putting together next year's speakers. I also want to thank Doug Berkey, who is my staff director at the Mitchell Institute, who really helped honcho this study through. General Deftula is not here, but again, he was also instrumental. Want to thank Nikki particularly, and Nate, and particularly also the wonderful people at the Aerospace Corporation who made this possible, who really worked very close with us. So with that, I want to thank you all. We have a breakfast, remember, Friday with General Raymond. We will also have an after seminar roundtable with him as well. I want to thank again our two authors. Thank you so much, and Jamie, for a wonderful job they did. Would you all give them a very warm round of applause?
Copies available on your chairs and on the way out if you
With
someone
that,
stole
thank
your
you very
chair.
much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for being here as well. We will see you Friday.